The last bills in my wallet felt like scraps of paper more than money, yet I traded them for something no sane man would want: a corpse of steel, 100 tons of rust choking in rust and weeds. It wasn't a spirit I bought, but a derelict train car abandoned in the mountains, its windows shattered like blind eyes staring back at me. People said it was junk fit only for the scrapyard, but in that ruin, I saw something different. Maybe a shelter, maybe a coffin, maybe the last chance a broken soldier like me had left. The silence before it was crushing. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that presses on your chest heavy as grief, echoing louder than gunfire. My dogs felt it too. Atlas, my German shepherd, stood rigid at my side, every muscle tense, while Luna, the husky with pale, restless eyes, whined low as if to remind me I wasn't completely alone. Their warmth was the only tether keeping me from sinking into the weight of my own mistakes. This was not a beginning anyone would choose. It was madness to sell off everything: my furniture, my wife's keepsakes, even the last traces of the life I once built, just to drag a rusted rail car into the woods. But madness is sometimes the only thing that keeps a man breathing when hope has long since left. Today, I want you to walk with me into that moment, into the storm of silence, loss, and the faint flicker of something worth saving. If my story holds you for a while, subscribe so you don't miss the next step. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The image of that rusted rail car lingered in my mind long after I signed away the last of my possessions. But before steel and vines, before the mountains swallowed me whole, there was the apartment. That single dim room had become my tomb long before I ever found the train. The silence inside it was suffocating, heavy as wet wool on my shoulders. It clung to the water-stained ceiling, curled into the peeling paint, and settled in the dust motes that floated through the single shaft of late afternoon light. I used to think explosions were the loudest thing a man could carry in his memory, but I was wrong. It was silence. The silence after she was gone. The silence after the calls stopped. The silence of defeat. I sat in the one surviving armchair, its fabric rubbed thin like a worn-out uniform, watching the light crawl across the cracked floorboards. The chair had been ours, once Anna's favorite spot to read, her legs tucked up under her while she smiled over the top of a paperback. That smile could disarm me faster than any rifle in enemy hands. Now the chair held only me, a man bent beneath years of war and loss. My short brown hair had given way to streaks of gray at the temples, and the fine lines in my face had deepened into something permanent, like old scars carved into stone. I was a soldier in his early 50s, tall but lean body, still wiry with muscle that no longer knew where to spend its energy. Anna had been gone for 2 years. A swift, merciless illness took her before I could even grasp that she was slipping away. She fought bravely, as she had always lived, but it was not a battle she could win. I had faced down enemies on foreign soil, stared into the eyes of men who wanted me dead, but nothing left me as defenseless as watching the woman I loved vanish piece by piece. Her absence was louder than gunfire, heavier than combat gear. After she died, the house became too large, too hollow. When I lost her, I lost the rhythm of my days, the anchor of my nights. If losing Anna was the first strike, the second was the collapse of my business. A logistics company I had poured my savings, sweat, and soul into. I built it from nothing after leaving the service, believing I could create a future worth living for both of us. For a while it thrived: contracts, rolled in trucks, carried freight across state lines, and I thought I'd found my second act. But a partner's betrayal gutted it, and the market's cruelty finished the job. Within months the company was gone. My savings evaporated, my credit followed, and with it the last proof that I could still build something in this world. Failure layered on failure. I had been a soldier, a husband, a builder. Now I was none of those things. I was simply a man alone in a crumbling apartment with nothing but the hollow echo of his own breathing. I kept my medals in a drawer, their shine dulled by dust. They had meant something once, proof of endurance, sacrifice, valor. But now they were reminders of a man I no longer recognized. It was Atlas who stirred me first. My German shepherd, 5 years old, slate-gray coat gleaming even in the gloom, nudged his heavy head against my hand. Atlas had the kind of patience I could never muster, steady, loyal, always watchful. He was a guardian not only of doors and shadows, but of me, a man falling apart. His amber eyes seemed to know more than he should, as if he understood the depths I was drowning in. Luna was different. A husky with eyes like shards of ice, and a restless energy that filled the room. She would pace when I grew too still, whine when the weight of silence pressed me down. If Atlas was my shield, Luna was the spark I couldn't quite extinguish, the small flame of life reminding me I hadn't yet faded completely. Between the two of them I was tethered to something real, something breathing. The apartment itself mocked me. Every crack in the wall told me how far I'd fallen. The refrigerator hummed half-heartedly. A ghost of abundance, long gone. The laptop on the chip table was my only window to the outside world, and even that felt like staring through glass too thick to break. I spent hours scrolling through job listings, though most of them demanded skills I had once possessed but now seemed to have rusted away like unused weapons. The younger men could move faster, think sharper, bend without breaking. My bones carried the stiffness of years, my mind the exhaustion of battles both fought and lost. I searched for the cheapest bags of dog food, the bulk brands with more filler than nutrition, my pride cracking each time I realized even that might stretch me thin. I avoided the mirror, not wanting to face the man looking back. It wasn't age that haunted me, it was the absence of purpose. A soldier without a mission is just a shadow, and shadows fade when no one is watching. Memories haunted the apartment. A framed photo of Anna on the nightstand, her eyes laughing at me as if daring me to keep living. A smaller photo tucked in the corner of the mirror, Leo, my son, barely 16 when it was taken. He had his mother's eyes restless and bright, but our last conversation had been filled with anger. After Anna's funeral, I couldn't hold us together. I buried myself in work, and he drifted angry at the father who was present in body but absent in spirit. That photo was the only connection I still dared to keep. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and every day that passed made the silence heavier. Some nights when the city's noise softened to a low hum, I thought about ending it. Not with drama, not with spectacle, just slipping quietly out of this life, the way I had slipped out of relevance. But every time that thought crept too close, Atlas would lift his head from his paws and stare at me, steady and unblinking, as if daring me to abandon him. And Luna would paw at the door, begging for a walk, demanding motion, refusing to let me disappear into stillness. So I endured. Not living, not thriving, but enduring. Day after day I woke to the same cracked ceiling, the same suffocating silence, the same absence where laughter used to be. And yet even in that ruin, something inside me refused to collapse completely. Maybe it was the discipline drilled into me years ago, maybe it was the loyalty of two dogs who didn't know the meaning of failure, or maybe it was the faint echo of Anna's voice in my memory. I was a man groping in the dark, broken but not finished. And, though I didn't know it yet, the madness of buying that rusted railcar would become the first spark of something I hadn't dared to believe in for a long time, a reason to keep moving forward. The days in that apartment blurred together, each one bleeding into the next like ink spreading through water. The silence grew heavier, pressing against my chest until it was hard to breathe. Atlas lay at my feet most of the time, his steady eyes fixed on me, as if willing me to move, while Luna wore a path in the carpet with her restless pacing. She would paw at the door, then whine in frustration when I didn't rise. Even they, loyal as ever, were growing uneasy in the weight of my stagnation. One evening I sat hunched over the battered laptop, scrolling through job postings that seemed written in another language. Marketing associate, data analyst, sales executive. Titles that belonged to a younger world. A world that had no use for a middle-aged veteran with scars on the inside as jagged as those on the outside. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, aimless, until finally I typed in something simple, something practical: cheapest bulk dog food. The page loaded, filled with grainy thumbnails of oversized bags and discount prices. I felt the sting of shame reduced to hunting bargains just to keep my two companions fed. Atlas nudged my knee with his nose, urging me not to sink too deep, while Luna's icy eyes watched me, sharply restless as ever. And then, with a slip of my hand on the trackpad, everything changed. The cursor darted across the screen and landed on a link buried among the advertisements. I clicked without meaning to. The page that opened wasn't for kibble or pet supplies. It was for something altogether stranger. A classified listing written in blunt, almost careless words. Vintage Pullman railcar, 1,920 seconds. Weathered. Needs TLC. Price negotiable. Scrap value. Buyer must arrange transport. Beneath the words was a single photograph. Grainy, poorly lit, yet powerful in its starkness. The image showed a long rusted shell swallowed by weeds and vines. Its windows were jagged black holes, the paint flaked away to bare steel riddled with rust. To most eyes it was junk, a hunk of metal waiting to collapse into itself. But to me, it was something else. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse quickening. The sight dragged me decades backward, to summers on my grandfather's land in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I could smell the sawdust from his workshop, hear the distant whistle of trains echoing through the valleys. He used to point out the old tracks running behind his property long since abandoned, and tell me stories of locomotives that carried people toward new beginnings. He said trains weren't just machines, they were symbols of hope and movement, iron veins carrying possibility into forgotten places. That memory struck like a match in dry tinder. I stared at the rusted hulk in the photograph and for the first time in years felt something stir inside me. It wasn't joy, not yet, more like a spark fragile and absurd. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something left I could build. The voice of reason tried to argue. What business did I have chasing after an ancient decaying train car? I had no money, no plan, no future. But then reason fell quiet, drowned out by a darker voice. What's the alternative? Sit in this apartment until you rot. I clicked the number listed. My voice cracked with disuse as I spoke to the man who answered. He sounded tired, almost amused that anyone was calling. It's junk, he said plainly. If you can haul it, it's yours. That was all it took. One brittle thread of a decision pulled, and my entire life began to unravel. The next morning, I called a transport company. The quote they gave nearly knocked the breath out of me, astronomical for a man already at the edge of ruin. But when I looked at Atlas and Luna at the hollow shell of the apartment, I realized I couldn't afford not to try. I sold everything. The armchair where Anna used to sit, the worn dining table, the old television flickering with static more often than sound. I opened the jewelry box that had belonged to my wife, my hands trembling as I let strangers place prices on pieces that had been parts of her. Every item I sold felt like a blade twisting deeper, but I told myself Anna would have understood. She had always believed in survival and starting over, no matter how impossible it seemed. Piece by piece, the apartment emptied. I kept only my army duffel with a few clothes, my medals tucked away. In their case, the framed photo of Anna I couldn't let go of, and the dog's bowls. When the last item left the room, I stood in the center of the bare floor, Atlas leaning against my leg, Luna circling anxiously. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was hollow, waiting to be filled. The transport company sent a truck 3 days later. I loaded my duffel, clipped the leashes onto Atlas and Luna, and walked out of that apartment without looking back. The building that had been my cage shrank behind me brick by brick until it was gone. The driver glanced at me in the mirror as the truck rumbled onto the highway. His eyes were skeptical, almost pitying. To him, I was just another broken-down man chasing a fool's dream. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was insane, spending what little remained of my life on a derelict railcar. But sitting in that passenger seat with Atlas stretched protectively at my feet and Luna's head resting on my knee, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but momentum. The road stretched ahead, winding into hills I hadn't seen since I was a boy. Every mile carried me farther from the silence of defeat and closer to a rusted shell waiting in the woods. It was madness, yes. But madness was the only thing that kept me breathing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the weight of grief and failure, I wondered, could a dead man's railcar carry me toward the faintest shadow of a new beginning? The road out of the city unspooled, like a long scar carrying me farther from everything I had been and closer to something I couldn't yet name. Atlas sprawled at my boots in the passenger cab of the heavy hauler, his steady amber eyes fixed on the blur of asphalt and trees outside. Luna sat upright against the seat, her pale blue gaze, never still, ears twitching with every new sound. The two of them were mirrors of my own state, Atlas patient, and grounded Luna, restless and uneasy. Together they anchored me as the truck's diesel heart roared us deeper into the Appalachians. The driver was a broad-shouldered young man with a thick beard, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't talk much, but when he glanced at me, it was with a mixture of pity and disbelief. I didn't blame him. To his eyes, I was just another washed-up veteran, chasing ghosts willing to bankrupt myself, hauling a rusted hunk of metal into the wilderness. He didn't see the photograph that had burned itself into my skull, the grainy image of a Pullman railcar swallowed by vines, or the memories it had awakened, memories of my grandfather's land, of stories told about iron giants carrying men toward new beginnings. The miles dragged on, and with each one the world around us shifted. The cracked billboards and shuttered factories of the industrial outskirts gave way to rolling hills that seemed to breathe with a softer rhythm. Old barns sagged against the weight of years, paint peeling in long strips, while church steeples stabbed through small towns that seemed suspended between decay and endurance. The further we went, the more the land reclaimed itself, swallowing fences in ivy, pushing weeds through forgotten driveways. Civilization thinned, and the mountains rose up hazy and blue, their peaks wreathed in mist like watchful sentinels. The driver grunted as he turned onto a narrow dirt road, more suggestion than path. Branches scraped the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers, their brittle twigs snapping against the steel. The hauler groaned in protest tires, spitting mud as it climbed. Atlas shifted beside me, ears pricked, sensing the change. Luna whined low in her throat, her restless energy spiking with the scent of pine and damp earth pressing through the cracked window. "This it?" the driver asked, voice doubtful. I looked out through the windshield at the wall of green rising before us. A sagging chain-link gate strangled by vines stood half open like a broken jaw. Beyond it, the faint outline of rusted tracks curved into the forest, half swallowed by roots and time. "Yes," I said quietly, though my voice didn't sound like my own. The process of unloading the railcar was brutal, graceless. The winch screamed, steel cables straining as if the machine itself wanted to refuse me. The railcar shuddered, screeched, then finally lurched onto the half-buried tracks. It landed with a metallic groan that reverberated through the clearing like a sigh from the grave. Even the driver winced. He wiped his hands, muttered something about fools and their money, and left without another word. The growl of his engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence older than my grief. Only the whisper of wind in the pines and the distant gurgle of a creek dared to fill it. Atlas and Luna pressed close to me as I turned to face what I had bought with the last of my life. The photograph hadn't done it justice. It was worse. The rust wasn't a surface blush, it was a deep consuming cancer that had eaten through the steel skin. Holes yawned where rivets had failed, jagged edges catching the fading light like teeth. Vines wrapped the body tight, binding it like a prisoner. The windows gaped dark, and empty shards of glass still clinging like broken memories. The air smelled of mold, of damp earth, of old oil, gone sour. It was no home. It was a tomb. For a long moment I just stood there, boots rooted to the overgrown, clearing the weight of my decision pressing down. My heart beat a ragged rhythm in my chest, fear, disbelief, and a strange thrill twined together. Luna barked once sharp and insistent, breaking the paralysis. She bounded forward, sniffing at the weed's tail, cutting arcs of defiance in the air. Atlas stayed back a step, eyes wary, body taut, a sentinel unwilling to trust what lay ahead. I moved closer, hand brushing against the railcar's corroded flank. The metal was rough, pitted cold, even in the last warmth of the afternoon Sunday. Beneath the decay, I felt something solid. Bones. A skeleton, yes, but one that could still be raised if I had the strength to try. The door resisted me. Its handle was stiff with rust, locked by years of neglect, but I threw my weight against it. With a screech like tearing metal it gave. The stench that poured out hit me like a physical blow, stale, air sharp with rot, heavy with dust. I gagged, raised an arm to my face, and stepped inside. Darkness swallowed me. My boots crunched on debris, shards of glass, scraps of fabric, the husks of long-forgotten bottles. Faded graffiti covered the walls, half lost to peeling paint. The stuffing of torn seats lay scattered nests for creatures long gone. Dust rose in lazy clouds, with every movement clinging to my throat. Atlas hesitated at the threshold, his body low, ears back. Luna darted in nose, working furiously, curiosity outweighing caution. The sun dipped behind the trees, shadows stretching long and sharp across the clearing. The air grew colder, the beauty of the wilderness curdling into menace. For a moment I questioned everything. What had I done? I had traded the last remnants of my life for a corpse of iron. I was no savior, no builder, just a man clinging to madness. But then Atlas pushed inside, pressing his body against my leg. His steady weight grounded me, his presence a silent command not to retreat. Luna circled once, and then settled beside us, her pale eyes glinting in the dim light. The three of us stood together in that hollow ruin, and the despair began to shift. Yes, it was a tomb. But it was also a challenge. The walls might have been scarred, the windows shattered, the roof pitted with rust. Yet the frame stood, the skeleton endured, and for the first time in years I felt a flicker of purpose. This wasn't the end. It was the battlefield I had chosen. Out there under the rising moon, the railcar groaned and settled as if acknowledging me. It was as broken as I was, but still standing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin. The first night inside the railcar was a blur of cold air and restless dreams. Every creak of the metal frame felt like an accusation, every whisper of the wind through broken windows a reminder of how far I had fallen. Atlas lay pressed against my side, his steady warmth anchoring me, while Luna curled near my feet, her soft whines cutting through the silence. I drifted in and out of sleep, wrapped not in comfort but in a stubborn refusal to leave. Morning came pale and gray, the kind of light that made everything look harsher. My back ached, my throat was dry, but one thing was clear: retreat wasn't an option. I tore open the door and stepped into the clearing lungs, filling with the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The forest felt indifferent to me, as though testing whether I would endure. I looked back at the railcar, its rusted skin glowing dull in the weak Sunday. It was a wreck, yes, but it was mine now. If I was to live here, it had to change. The first task was simple, if brutal: cleaning. Armed with little more than a broom I'd salvaged from the truck, and my bare hands I began. Atlas sat by the doorway, eyes following me with soldierly focus, while Luna darted in and out, nosing through piles of debris as though searching for treasure. I swept decades of dirt into clouds that clung to my throat and eyes. Rotten wood cracked beneath my boots as I dragged out seat frames twisted with rust stuffing spilling like guts from their seams. Empty bottles clinked as I tossed them outside into a growing pile of refuse. Every object I removed was another reminder of time's indifference. How many nights had strangers sheltered here? How many storms had beaten against these walls? The work was punishing. Sweat soaked my shirt, muscles burned in ways I hadn't felt since deployment. My hands blistered and split raw against the coarse broom handle and jagged edges of corroded steel. But strangely, the pain was welcome. It was proof that I still had fight in me, that my body could still answer when called upon. Each scrape of the brush, each thud of discarded debris was a small defiance against the collapse that had defined me for too long. It was while clearing a corner near the rear of the car that I stumbled. My boot caught on a loose floorboard, the wood rotten and soft beneath its surface. I cursed, dropped to my knees, and began prying at the splintered pieces. The board gave way with surprising ease, revealing a hollow space beneath. I reached in, expecting nothing more than nests of insects or the remains of vermin. Instead, my fingers brushed against something solid. With effort, I dragged it into the light, a rectangular wooden chest bound in iron straps mottled with rust. Damp but intact. My breath caught. Atlas moved closer, sniffing cautiously, while Luna pawed excitedly at the ground, as if she sensed the weight of the moment. I knelt before the chest, hands trembling as I worked at the corroded latch. It resisted, then yielded with a sharp snap. The hinges groaned as I lifted the lid, and a rush of scent old oil cedar time itself rose into the air. Inside, cushioned by what remained of felt lining, lay tools. Real tools. Not the disposable kind sold in cheap hardware stores, but solid crafted instruments built to last. A claw hammer, its wooden handle polished smooth by years of use. A set of chisels, their steel still sharp beneath a film of rust. A hand drill, a level. A saw, with the faint initials WB burned into its grip. I touched them reverently, memories rising unbidden. My grandfather's hands guiding mine, his voice steady and patient as he taught me how to drive a nail straight, how to measure twice before cutting. These were his tools. His mark was burned into them, his craft etched into every worn surface. For a moment, the railcar around me seemed to shift, no longer a carcass but a canvas. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was something else. A thick, leather-bound notebook. My fingers trembled as I unwrapped it, revealing pages filled with neat, strong, cursive diagrams of roofing frames, notes on planting seasons, sketches of furniture designs. But more than that, words. His thoughts. A home is not four walls, one page read, but the space you protect with your effort. If you fix something with care, it will carry your handprint longer than your name. I sat back, hard notebook in my lap, eyes burning. The railcar no longer felt empty. It held something now: legacy, guidance, a compass. My grandfather had left me more than stories. He had left me a mission. I spent the rest of the day with a new rhythm. Every swing of the hammer, every board I dragged out, every shard of glass I removed, was no longer just labor. It was obedience to his voice echoing across time. I patched holes in the floor with wood scavenged from discarded seats, measuring with care, cutting clean lines, remembering his lessons. Atlas watched solemnly. Luna wagged her tail every time I drove a nail home. Together, they were my audience, my silent crew. By evening, the rail car was still battered, still a ruin, but the difference was undeniable. The floor was cleared of debris. Light from the setting sun slanted through broken windows, painting golden lines across fresh-swept planks. The air, though still heavy with age, was cleaner, touched with the smell of pine and sweat. My muscles throbbed, my hands ached, but my heart was steadier than it had been in years. As night fell, I sat with the notebook by lantern light. Atlas pressed against my leg, Luna sprawled across my feet. I traced the lines of my grandfather's writing, feeling his presence as surely as if he sat beside me. The despair of the night before had shifted. This wasn't punishment anymore. This was a mission. I closed the notebook, placed the hammer at my side, and looked around the dim interior. It was still a wreck, but it was our wreck. And for the first time since Anna's passing, I felt the faint but undeniable truth that I had something worth building again. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm I hadn't felt since my days in uniform. Each morning began with the sting of cold air in my lungs, the sound of Atlas shifting his weight at the door, and Luna's eager paws scratching against the floor, ready to explore. I would open the chest, choose a tool, and set to work. The railcar slowly bent to my will floor's patched, jagged glass, removed rust, scraped, until my arms trembled with exhaustion. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the ruin had begun to feel less like a tomb, and more like a stubborn patient refusing to die. It was one of those afternoons, sweat dripping from my brow as I planed down a piece of scavenged lumber, when Luna startled me with a sharp bark. She bolted through the door, a blur of white and gray, and I followed, wiping sawdust from my eyes. That's when I saw him, a boy maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing. He had sandy hair that caught the late sun, and a freckled face that carried no fear, only wide-eyed curiosity. Atlas moved first, placing himself between me and the boy, his stance protective but not aggressive. The boy laughed high and unrestrained and extended a stick. Luna snatched it immediately, tail whipping, and the boy squealed with delight. "Finn," a woman's voice rang out. From the trees a figure emerged, a tall, slender woman in worn jeans and a plain cotton shirt. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and though her face held worry, her voice carried authority. "Step back from that dog." I raised my hands quickly. "They're friendly," I said, my voice rough with disuse. "I'm sorry they got away from me." The boy grinned. "He's just playing mom." The woman's wary eyes flicked between Atlas, who sat obediently at my side, and Luna, who was already dropping the stick at Finn's feet again. Slowly, her posture softened. "You're the man who hauled that train car in," she said, finally, her tone more curious than judgmental. I nodded, trying to make it livable. "My grandfather owned this land." She introduced herself as Sarah and the boy as Finn. They lived in a modest house, a short walk through the woods, though I'd never noticed. She worked from home, she said, designing graphics for companies in town. The encounter was brief, a polite exchange standing awkwardly in the clearing, but something about it lingered after they left. For the first time since arriving, I knew I wasn't entirely alone. Over the next week, Finn began to appear at the edge of the clearing, at first shy and watchful, then bold enough to wander closer. By the third day, he marched straight into the railcar and declared, "This place is awesome." He became my unofficial apprentice, chattering constantly, asking questions about tools, about wood, about why I measured twice before cutting. He would hand me nails, hold a measuring tape, or simply sit beside Atlas, narrating every move I made as though he were recording a great adventure. His energy filled the hollow space with a kind of life I hadn't expected. Sarah was cautious at first, but she began to stop by with fresh bread or a jar of preserves. An elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, shuffled into the clearing one morning with a bundle of old lumber. "Better you use it than it rot in my barn," he grunted, leaving it without ceremony. Small kindnesses accumulated: a quilt from the church, a sack of potatoes from another neighbor. The clearing, once only mine, was slowly stitched into the fabric of a community. But the forest has a way of reminding you that nothing comes without trial. One late afternoon, the air grew heavy, greenish-gray clouds piling high above the peaks. The forest went still, birds vanishing, wind holding its breath. Years in the field taught me the signs I knew a storm was coming, and not a gentle one. I secured tarps, stacked lumber under cover, and ushered Atlas and Luna inside as the first fat drops of rain spattered against the roof. The drizzle became a torrent, hammering metal with a deafening roar. Thunder cracked so violently the railcar shuddered. Yet my patches held. Water did not pour through the roof as it would have weeks before. I lit a lantern, its glow steady against the storm's fury, and felt a flicker of pride. Then I realized Finn hadn't come by that day. My gut clenched. He was a boy who loved storms, who would wander close just to watch the rain. The thought lodged itself in my chest like shrapnel. What if he was out there? A sound cut through the storm, a faint high-pitched cry. My blood turned to ice. "Finn," I whispered. I grabbed the coil of rope hanging by the door, strapped Atlas into his harness, and clipped Luna's lead to my belt. "With me," I commanded. Their bodies stiffened with focused soldiers, ready for orders. We plunged into the storm. The path to the creek had become a river of mud sucking at my boots. Trees whipped and groaned, rain driving into my face like needles. The creek, normally a gentle ribbon of water, was now a raging torrent, brown and swollen, carrying logs like matchsticks. And there across the torrent, clinging to the roots of a tree on a patch of earth that was dissolving beneath him, was Finn. He was soaked, shivering, eyes wide with terror. "Help!" he screamed, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. There was no time to think, only act. I lashed one end of the rope around a thick oak on my side and tied the other to Atlas's harness. I knelt, cupping his head, meeting his steady gaze. "Go get him. Bring him back." Atlas surged forward without hesitation, muscles straining against the current. The rope went taut, vibrating with the fury of the water, but he pushed on. Luna barked furiously, leaping against the lead, wanting to follow. I held fast, shouting encouragement over the roar. Atlas reached the far bank, scrambled onto the patch of earth, and pressed against Finn. The boy threw his arms around the dog's neck, sobbing, clinging to him as though he were a lifeline. "Hold on," I bellowed. "Hold the rope, and don't let go." Atlas turned, pulling Finn toward the rope. The current fought, but the line held. I hauled with every ounce of strength left in me, Luna bracing at my side, teeth bared, as if growling at the storm itself. Slowly, agonizingly, they crossed. Finn stumbled onto the bank, Atlas beside him, both soaked and shaking, but alive. Behind me, a voice cried out, Sarah, pale and frantic, having followed the sound of her son's screams. She fell to her knees, gathering Finn into her arms, her relief raw and unguarded. When her eyes lifted to me, to Atlas dripping with mud, and Luna still straining against the lead, they were filled not with suspicion but with gratitude. Word of the rescue spread faster than the storm's retreat. By the next morning, neighbors arrived not with cautious curiosity but with open admiration. To them, I was no longer the broken veteran hiding in a rusted car. I was the man who braved the storm, the soldier whose dogs had saved a boy. Mr. Henderson clapped my shoulder with surprising strength. "You've earned your place here," he said simply. Sarah, her voice thick, whispered, "You saved my son." For me, it wasn't heroism. It was instinct. It was what soldiers do: protect, endure, bring someone home. But in their eyes, it was something more. The railcar, once seen as a wreck dragged into the woods, began to carry a new name whispered among the neighbors: Hopeline Station. And though I didn't say it out loud, I knew they were right. The storm left behind a world scrubbed clean, but inside me the wreckage was still raw. Saving Finn had turned the community's eyes toward me with respect, yet it had also unlocked a door I had kept nailed shut. That boy's laughter, his small hands clutching Atlas's fur, reminded me of a different child, my own son Leo. For years, silence had stood between us, like an unscalable wall. After Anna's death, I had buried myself in work, in grief, in anything but fatherhood. Our last conversation had ended with slammed doors and words neither of us could take back. That night, after the neighbors left and Sarah carried Finn home safe, I sat at the table I had built from salvaged planks. The lantern glowed warm against the steel walls, Atlas asleep by the door, Luna sprawled at my feet. I pulled the old notebook from my grandfather's chest, the one filled with sketches and wisdom, and placed a blank sheet beside it. For a long time, I stared at the page. My hands trembled not from fatigue but from the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, I picked up the pen. The words came haltingly at first, then in a flood. I told Leo about the collapse, losing Anna, losing the business, losing myself. I confessed the silence the way I had failed him, by vanishing into my own pain. I told him about the madness of buying a rusted train car and how it had nearly broken me again until Atlas and Luna and strangers who became friends pulled me back. I described the storm, the rescue, the moment I realized that saving another child forced me to face the one I had lost. to distance, not death. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew I hadn't earned it. I only asked for a chance to tell him who I was now, not the broken man in an empty apartment, but the man rebuilding something worth standing inside. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and wrote his name across the front with a hand steadier than I expected. Days passed. I worked, I waited, I forced myself not to listen for footsteps that never came. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Atlas's head snapped up. He whined low ears, fixed on the tree line. A figure emerged slowly from the shadows, a tall young man, lean and uncertain, his jacket too clean for the woods. My heart stuttered. It was Leo. We stood staring across the clearing, years of silence crackling like static between us. Then Bear's successor Atlas broke the stillness, tail wagging, trotting forward with a joyful bark. Luna followed, bounding with wild energy, circling the young man who had once been a boy at my side. Leo's hands dropped instinctively to their fur, and for the first time in years I saw his face soften. I walked forward, not fast, not daring to break the fragile thread. "You got my letter," I said. My voice was rough, uncertain. He nodded. "I did." His eyes flicked to the rail car, to the patched windows and smoke curling from the chimney. "You really did this?" "With help," I admitted. There was no dramatic embrace, no instant forgiveness. Instead, there was the slow building of something sturdier, conversation by the fireworks, side by side, on a small woodshed, quiet moments where words weren't needed. One evening, staring into the flames, I finally said the words I had carried like shrapnel in my chest. "I'm sorry, son, for not being there when it mattered." Leo was quiet for a long time. Then he said softly, "I'm sorry too, for walking away before I understood what you were carrying." The clearing seemed to breathe around us, the forest whispering approval. The railcar that had once looked like a tomb now stood as a station of hope, not just for me, but for the boy who had found me again as a man. As the fire crackled, Luna chased falling leaves across the clearing. Atlas stretched between us like a bridge, and for the first time in years I felt whole. The soldier, the father, the man I had come home.